Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to learn how the ballpoint pen was invented. So, let's dive in. In 1888, there were two major problems facing writers around the world. One was the quill. The feathers that most people used for writing were often too expensive or simply unavailable. The other problem was the ink. Most inks were water-based and would take hours to dry. The only ink that dried quickly enough to keep pace with the fastest writers was, well, shoe polish. Shoe polish. So it should be no surprise that when a Romanian journalist named John Loud came up with a new type of writing instrument in 1884, it was an instant success. It consisted of a metal nib attached to a plastic or rubber pen holder and was dipped in ink just like a quill. But this style of pen, known as the fountain pen, could hold more ink than a quill and did you need to be constantly dipped into an ink bottle. It also used water-based ink that dried fairly quickly, which made it much more convenient than its predecessors. For the first few decades, the fountain pen was the perfect solution for all writers. But as the century wore on, some problems began to emerge. For starters, the thin metal nibs were prone to breaking. Also, fountain pens required quite a bit of skill to use properly. They needed to be held at a steep angle, and the pressure had to be applied just right. Otherwise, ink would end up smeared across the page or leaking out of the pen entirely. And as you can imagine, having a pen leak ink all over your shirt isn't exactly fun. In fact, it was such a common problem that the French started using a special term for it. They called it lec-mich, which translates roughly to lick me. If that sounds familiar, you might have even experienced it yourself. And while it's certainly possible to master the art of using a fountain pen, it takes time and practice. It's far easier said than done. So imagine being an average person who just wants to sign a document or fill out a form. You grab a pen from the cup on the desk, dip it into the ink, and start writing. Pretty soon you realize that this pen isn't like the others. It's got a weird little ball at the end of it. As you pull it away from the paper, the ball rolls back in. Before long, you finished your signature, and you put the pen down without bothering to clean it off. After all, who cares if there's still a little ink on the tip? It's not gonna stain, right? Well, in most cases, it won't. That's because this pen doesn't use water-based ink. Instead, it uses oil-based ink. Oil-based inks are harder to clean off of paper, but they dry much faster. And the strange little ball on the end of the pen ensures that the ink flows smoothly onto the page. Even if you apply a lot of pressure, the ball helps prevent ink from leaking out of the sides. So what does this all mean? Well, let's find out how the ballpoint pen was invented. In the early 20th century, László Bíró was an extremely busy man. By day, he worked as an engineer, and by night, he moonlighted as a newspaper editor. For László, this meant he was constantly surrounded by writing implements, but none of them were particularly good. Fountain pens leaked. Ink bottles were messy. Pens were uncomfortable to hold. There had to be a better way. László never considered becoming an inventor himself. He was satisfied with his job as a journalist. Then, one night, everything changed. László was staying late at the office and working on an article when his wife came in to pick him up. On her way out, she noticed his fountain pen lying on the table. She picked it up, but before she knew it, ink was staining the pages of the newspaper. At that moment, László realized how common this problem really was. Virtually everyone had a pen or pencil that leaked, stained, or blotched. That's when he began sketching ideas for a new kind of pen. László was already familiar with ink and how difficult it was to get it from one place to another without leaving a mess behind. But there was one type of ink that seemed to defy this problem. Inks used for ballpoint pens consist of very fine particles suspended in oil.
Okay.
These particles are so small that they appear to be a solid, yet they behave like a liquid.
Okay.
Inks made this way tend to clump together, which makes them difficult to get through a thin nib.
Okay.
But this becomes less of a problem when the nib is replaced by a ball. When pressed against paper, the ball forces the ink through tiny gaps between the ball and the pen's metal shell. This means there's less friction and ink is able to flow more easily. Once it hits the page, the inertia keeps the ink moving until it reaches a point where the friction with the paper is greater than the force from the ball. At this point, the ink stops flowing and the ball continues moving. Of course, there was still a problem with ink leaking around the ball. To fix this, László made sure that the ball sat slightly lower than the top of the pen. This created a seal that kept ink from seeping out the sides. With this invention, László believed he'd solved the problem of leaking pens. But he didn't stop there. He wanted his pen to work for writers, engineers, and artists alike, which meant he had to solve a whole new set of problems. See, László didn't want his pen to leave streaks of ink on the page. He wanted it to flow smoothly like a fountain pen, but he didn't want it to bleed like a fountain pen either. He needed a way to keep the ink from mixing, and he found the answer in an unexpected place. In 1931, László visited Paris and checked out a new exhibit at the Musée d'Orsay. It was a collection of modern art from America, including works by Georgia O'Keeffe, Edward Hopper, and Andrew Wyeth. But the artwork that really caught László's attention wasn't a painting or a sculpture. It was a simple black and white photograph. In the photo, a ballerina was leaping through the air and mid-tumble. At that moment, László had an epiphany. It dawned on him why ballpoint pens were always leaving streaks of ink behind. The problem wasn't the ink or the ball, it was the paper. See? Most papers weren't smooth like the surface of a photograph. They were rough. When the ball hit an uneven part of the page, it left behind a streak of ink. This wasn't a problem for László anymore. All he had to do was make sure the surface of his paper was completely smooth. But then he wondered, why hadn't anyone thought of this before? Well, it turns out someone had. Back in 1854, an Englishman named John Henry Pepper proposed a similar idea. He suggested using a ballpoint pen on specially coated paper. Unfortunately, the paper coating he recommended was very expensive and hard to make, so his idea never caught on. But László knew that there was a way to make paper smoother and cheaper. All he had to do was copy the technology used in modern wallpaper. Wallpaper manufacturers had discovered that a layer of gelatin could be applied to the surface of paper and smoothed out using a roller. This created a perfectly smooth surface without adding much cost or complexity. With this technique, László was finally ready to mass-produce his new pen, but he didn't call it the ballpoint pen. He knew that there were already patents out there for ballpoint writing instruments. He wanted something that described the unique way his pen flowed onto the page, so he called it the Bic crystal. László's timing couldn't have been better. In 1938, he received a patent for the first commercially successful ballpoint pen. Then World War II broke out, and pilots quickly adopted the for writing important documents at high altitudes. Of course, as you may have noticed, World War II ended a long time ago. Yet the ballpoint pen is still the world's most popular writing instrument. After all, it's not much fun trying to sign a birthday card with a quill. So the next time you pick up a pen, remember László Bíró and his wife, who accidentally invented a worldwide sensation. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more fun science videos. Bye-bye.